Hello YouTube, I hope you're having a fantastic day. In today's video, I want to talk about the Excel 2019 exam, and I want to look at the domain called Perform Operations by using Formulas and Functions. Overall, this accommodates for 20 to 25% of the overall exam. I'll go ahead and throw up a graphic so you can see what this domain covers. I apologize for this video getting long, but I wanted to make sure that I covered this domain carefully and clearly as we went through each of the formulas and functions found in this domain. In today's video, we're going to look at insert references, calculate and transform data, and format and modify text. This is the domain that causes people the most heartache and grief. I want to give you some advice. The first thing is take a deep breath. The worst thing that you could do on this exam is write off all the formulas and functions and say, I'm not going to do that. And I've had people do that, and it really hurts them on this exam. You don't have to get all of the formulas and functions right, just most of them. The second thing that I want to encourage you to do is to take an inventory of all the formulas and functions that are found on this exam, and not only know what they are, but what they carry out on the exam. That way, when you're taking the exam, you know in the back of your mind, you have a drop-down list of the formulas and functions you could be asked to carry out. And you don't want to choose anything outside of that area because the test tells you specifically the functions and formulas that you could be asked to carry out. So don't panic and make sure you have that list. Let's go ahead and jump into Excel. We're talking about the Excel 2019 exam, and we're looking at the domain called Perform Operations by using Formulas and Functions. We're looking at subdomain Insert References. The first thing that this subdomain tells us that we need to be able to do is to insert relative, absolute, and mixed references. Let's go ahead and look at using a relative reference. I'm going to put my cursor in J5. I'm going to go to the Insert Function button, and then I'm going to select Sum. You could have manually typed this out, but I prefer on exams like this to use the function builder when I can because it gives me helps at the bottom. The sum function's fairly simple, so I won't need the helps, but it can definitely help you out if you're not sure what to do. My number one is going to be E5 to I5, and then I'm going to click OK. Now that I've put that in, I'm going to go ahead and use the autofill or the drag fill to copy that formula down, and I'm going to put my cursor back in J5 so that we can look at that reference. Notice that it says sum E5 to I5, but watch what happens when I click on J6. Notice that the reference updated to E6 to I6. Same thing when I go to J7, the reference is E7 to I7. When I copied that formula down, Excel was able to just move my reference down one because it was a relative reference. Most of the formulas that you use in Excel are probably relative reference. Let's go ahead and look at using an absolute reference. I'm going to put my cursor in A11, and I'm going to do the equal sign, and I'm going to select on A5, and I'm going to hit enter. Notice that Holly's name appears. This cell just directly links A5. And if I click and drag this down using the autofill or the drag fill, notice it just continues copying the next line down. But let's say I don't want that. I'm going to put my cursor back in A11. I'm going to go to the formula bar. I'm going to select my reference. And what I'm going to do is hit the F4 key on my keyboard. And notice that dollar signs were placed in front of the column and the row. This makes this an absolute reference. Watch what happens when I hit enter. Nothing out of the ordinary happens. It just brings back in Holly's name. But when I try to use drag fill this time, notice it's always Holly. And if I try and drag right, it's always Holly. And if I click in any one of these cells, the reference is A5. That's because this is absolute. It's locked. It's not going to change because we put dollar signs in front of the column and the row. The last point of this is that we need to be able to use mixed referencing. I'm going to go ahead and do a quick sum of the numbers that I just added. We have a total of 134 hours worked. I want to find out what percentage of each employee represents that 134 hours. So I'm going to put my cursor in K5. I'm going to do equals J5. I'm going to do divided by, and I'm going to select my J10 cell. I'm going to go to my reference at the top with J10 selected, which is our cell that we're not going to want moved around. We don't want this cell to slide as we drag fill our reference. I'm going to hit the F4 key. Hitting F4 once makes this a full absolute reference. But if I hit F4 again, notice that the $ was removed from the J column. What that means is the J can change. So if I drag my reference right, it'll go from J to K to L. I'll show you what I mean. Hit enter. And if I click and drag to the right, notice I'm getting an error message, and that's because it can't divide by 0. But notice my reference here is J5, but when I click on L, it's now showing K. It's referencing this cell. If I click here, we can see it's looking to those. I'm going to go ahead and undo what I've done. If I drag down, though, I still get the same answers because J is not moving when we move down. Let me just show you one other thing, and this will mark this wrong. But if I hit the F4 button again, it changes to just the column being locked. And when I hit enter, notice I get an error message, and that's because it's changing to J11, J12, and you can't divide by that. This part of the subdomain can be difficult. It's important that you play around with your different referencing options for this. The next thing that this subdomain says that we should be able to do is to reference name ranges and name tables in formulas. If I click my name box, you can see that I have a named range named Monday, and we're going to use that in what we're about to do. I'm going to put my cursor in E10. I'm going to do equals sum. I'm going to type in Monday. I'm going to divide by the number 5 because I have 5 employees, and I'm going to hit enter. And notice that it tells me that the average for my employees is 4.2 hours worked. This subdomain, while it might not seem like such a difficult section of this domain, can be quite difficult if you're not familiar with working with relative absolute mixed referencing, but also if you're not used to using named ranges in your functions. And I want to encourage you to practice manually hand keying in different types of formulas and functions, because oftentimes people don't use it as much as they use the built-in functions. And on something like the certification exam, while the task is not difficult to carry out, they might stumble or waste a lot of time on the exam because they're just not used to hand keying in all the parts of the function. So I want to encourage you to practice on this. We're looking at the second subdomain, calculate and transform data. There are 8 different functions within this section. The most difficult, of course, being the if function. We'll save that for last. This subdomain tells us that we should be able to perform calculations by using the average, max, min, and sum functions. The first one we'll look at is using the average. I'm going to put my cursor here in B12. These are simple functions, and you're probably familiar hand keying in this function. When you can, I want to encourage you to use the function builder, and that's what we'll do today, just because it gives you some helps down here at the bottom, as well as walks you through the function, and we'll see that more on some of the more complex formulas like the if function. The average function returns the average arithmetic mean of its arguments, which can be numbers or names, arrays, or references that contain numbers. With average selected, we'll click OK. And our number 1, we'll go ahead and just select the entire range of hours. You want to be careful on something like this and on the certification exam that you don't select the total row, because that's going to skew your data. And on the certification exam, you're probably going to get that task wrong. So just my hours selected for all the employees, I'll click OK. And it comes back as the average being 7.44. The next function that I want to look at is called max. We'll click insert function. I'll go ahead and type in max. The max function returns the largest value in a set of values. It ignores logical values and text. We'll click OK. Our number 1 range, we'll go ahead and just select all of our hours again. And what this function is going to do is return back the largest number. We'll click OK. The largest number in that range is 10, but notice if I click here on Ryan Kaiser and I type in 11, that function changes, as well as my average function. The opposite of the max function is the min function. So we'll put our cursor in B14. We'll click insert function. We'll type in min. The min function returns the smallest number in a set of values. It ignores logical values in text. We'll click OK. And we'll select our range again for hours. And we'll click OK. The smallest number returned is 0. And then the final function that we need to look at is called sum. With our cursor in B15, I'll click insert function. I'll type in sum. The sum function adds all the numbers in a range of cells. So we'll click OK, and we'll select our range. We'll click OK. The total numbers worked by all employees that week is 135 hours. The second point of this subdomain says that we should be able to count cells by using the count, COUNTA, and COUNTBLANK functions. I'm going to put my cursor in E12. I'll go to Insert Function. We'll type in count. The count function counts the number of cells in a range that contains numbers. That's important, contains numbers. So we'll click OK. And for this, I'm only going to select the Monday range and click OK. And notice that it returns back the value of 3. That's because we have 2 empty cells here. I'm going to do this function again, but this time, notice what happens when I choose the A column. Notice that I get a 0. And that's because this function is only looking for numbers. It doesn't look at text. Let's look at the COUNTA function. We'll click Insert Function. COUNTA counts the number of cells in a range that are not empty. So we'll click OK. For this, we'll select Tuesday's numbers, and we'll click OK. It returns back the value of 4. Of course, we have Ryan not working on Tuesday, so out of the 5 available cells, only 4 of them had numbers in it. Let's try doing this again, but with the name column again. Notice this time that even though the range that we selected was text, it still brought back that there were 5 names in that range. Let's look at using a COUNTBLANK. So we'll put our cursor in E14. We'll click Insert Function. We'll type in COUNTBLANK. The COUNTBLANK function counts the number of empty cells in a specified range of cells. And we'll click OK. For this, we'll select the Thursday through Friday range, and we'll click OK. And notice that it found 3 empty cells here. Let's go ahead and delete out Susan's last name, and we'll do this function again, and this time we'll do that last name column. And it returned the value of 1. There was 1 empty cell. So keep in mind, when you're working with the count functions for this exam, the count function specifically is looking at numbers. But with COUNTA and COUNTBLANK, you can use the function to look for text. The last point in this subdomain says that we should be able to perform conditional operations by using the if function. The if function can be intimidating if you've never used it before or you have limited usage. But let's go ahead and look at using that today. I'm going to put my cursor in K5. We'll click Insert Function. We'll type in if. The if function checks whether a condition is met and returns one value if true and another value if false. We'll click OK. So what we're going to do is we're going to look to see if the total hours is worked is greater than 30. If it is, we're going to just leave the cell blank. If it's false, we're going to put in increase hours. I have my cursor in the logical test. Excel is telling me that the logical test is any value or expression that can be evaluated to true or false. Our logical test for this is going to be to look at Holly's hours, total hours worked. So we'll click on J5. You could also type that out. And what we're going to do is J5 greater than 30? Notice that Excel is already telling me that this is true. If it were not true, it would say false. And if it's having a problem calculating what we're asking it to do, you would get an error message over here. So pay attention to what's going on over here on the right. I'm going to hit Tab on my keyboard to go to the value if true. So we'll leave that blank just to test this out and see what happens. My value if false is going to be what's returned if this argument is not true. For this, we said that we were going to use the text increase hours. And I'm going to hit Tab. And notice if you look very carefully, quotation marks were added around my text. This is a benefit of using the function builder to build your functions. Had you left this out and you were manually hand keying this function in, you're going to come back with an error message. So when you can, I want to encourage you to use the function builder. So I just want to do a quick review of this function because this is the one that gives people the most difficulties. Our logical test is telling Excel to look for something. For this, it's looking to the total hours for Holly and saying, is the hours worked greater than 30? You need to determine Excel if that's true or false. Our value if true is what do you want Excel to do if this is true? We left it blank for this. You could add text like we did for false, or you can actually have a calculation if you chose to, but we're just going to leave it blank for now. And then the value of false, what do you want Excel to do if this is not correct? And we put the text increase hours. So let's see what happens. Click OK. Notice that it put in 0. And if I click and drag this down, notice that some of them say increase hours and some of them say 0. Let me undo what I did. And let's go back to this function. And then click the insert function with my cursor in that cell. And this time, I want to show you this. If I don't want any text, if I put quotation mark, it's going to leave that cell empty. Watch what happens when I hit OK this time. Notice it's blank. And now when I click and drag, the cells where that criteria was true is left blank, and the cells that was false return the value of increase hours. Just for the example of this video, let me undo what I did. We'll go back to that cell. We'll click insert function to bring back up this dialog box. I want to show you that you can do calculations. For if true, I'm going to select J5, and what I'm going to do is -5. This is just a manual calculation, but you can use other functions like sum. You could put another if function in. That's called nesting. We're not going to do that for this, but just know that in addition to just this simple calculation, you can actually do more advanced calculations in the if function. So we'll click OK. Notice this time that it brought back 35. So it saw that it was true that they had worked more than 30 hours, and it subtracted the value that was in J5 by 5. And if I click and drag that down, notice it did the same for the other ones. We're looking at the subdomain called format and modify text. The first thing that this subdomain says that we should be able to do is to format text by using the right, left, and mid functions. I'm going to go ahead and park my cursor in I5. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the social number, and we're going to use the right function to pull data from these cells. I'm going to click on insert function. The function that I want is called right, so we'll type that in. The right function returns the specified number of characters from the end of a text string. So we'll click OK. The text is the text string that contains the characters you want to extract. For this, we want to choose E5. So we're telling Excel to look at E5. And from the right side, we need to tell Excel in the number of characters how many characters we want to extract. It says 1 if omitted. So for this, what we're going to do is we're going to pull the last 4 numbers in the social. So we'll go ahead and type in 4. Notice that it gives me what's going to populate here. 6, 7, 8, 9 is correct. We'll click OK. And if I click and drag that down, because this is a relative reference, we went ahead and it did it for the remaining cells. Let's look at the left function, which is the opposite of the right function. We'll put our cursor in J5. We'll go to insert function. I'll type in left. Left returns the specified number of characters from the start of a text string. Our text for this is going to be E5. We'll hit tab. And the number of characters are what we want to extract. We'll do the first 3 for this one. So we'll type in 3. And notice it shows that it's going to produce 1, 2, 3, which is what we want. And again, because this is a relative reference, if we click and drag that down, it's able to do the same thing for the other employees. Now let's look at the mid, because it's just a little bit more complicated than what we've looked at. With my cursor in K5, we'll click insert function. I'll type in mid. The mid function returns the characters from the middle of a text string, giving a starting position and length. We'll click OK. Our text for this is going to be our social again, and this time what we're going to do is extract the middle 2 numbers. Our start number is the position of the first character you want to extract. The first character in the text is 1. So for this, all I want to pull is the 4, 5. So let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4. The 5th spot is where we want to extract from. So we're going to go ahead and type in 5. I'll hit tab to go to the number of characters, and we're going to tell Excel that we just want to pull those 2 numbers. So we'll click 2, and it tells me that 45 is going to get pulled. That's exactly what I want. So we'll click OK, and we'll drag this down. And notice it's able to pull all of those numbers. This subdomain says that we should be able to format text by using upper, lower, and Lin functions. So I'm going to put my cursor in M5, and if we look at the B column for the last names, we can see that some of the spelling is all over the place. So we're going to use the upper function to change the text there. With my cursor in M5, I'm going to click insert function. The first function that I want is upper. The upper function converts a text string to all uppercase letters. This function is fairly simple. All we need to do is select the cell that we want to have the text all uppercase. For this, it's going to be B5, and it shows me it's going to be all caps Feltner. And that's exactly what we want. We'll click OK. And notice Feltner went from all lowercase to all uppercase. And if I drag this down, notice that Kaiser was spelled a little bit weird, and that's all uppercase now, as well as the other names that were spelled proper case. Let's look at the lower function. With our cursor in N5, I'll click Insert Function. I'll type in lower. We'll click OK. It's asking for the text that we want to select. Again, we're going to choose B5, and nothing's going to change because the name Feltner was already typed in lowercase, but we'll see what happens to the other names after we click OK. When we drag it down, notice it lowercased every single text spelling from the B column. Let's go and look at the Lin function, which is a little bit different. We'll put our cursor in O5. We'll click Insert Function. We'll type in Lin. The Lin function returns the number of characters in a text string. Okay? So for this, all we want to do is select the cell again. But notice what it's looking for in this text is the text whose length you want to find spaces count as characters. So that's important to note, spaces count as characters. For this, we'll select B5, and we'll click OK. And if I click and drag that down, notice it went ahead and it counted each character in that cell. I'm going to go ahead and put my cursor in front of Feltner, and I'm going to hit space and then hit enter to set that text. And notice that all of the functions, they are updated, but the main thing I wanted you to see is that the Lin number went from 6 to 7, and it's because it's counting that space in front of Feltner. The last thing that this subdomain tells us that we should be able to do is to format text using the CONCAT and TEXTJOIN functions. In this group, these are definitely the two functions that are most difficult to perform. Let's look at using CONCAT first. I'm going to put my cursor in C5, and what we're going to do is use the CONCAT function to combine these two names together in one cell. So with my cursor in C5, I'm going to click Insert Function. We'll type in CONCAT. Now if you look here, CONCAT and concatenate are listed. The CONCAT function replaced concatenate, so you want to make sure you select the right one. You might be familiar with using concatenate, but for this exam, you want to use CONCAT. The CONCAT function concatenates a list or range of text strings. So we'll click OK. Our text 1 is going to be the first name here, and that's going to be Holly. I'll hit Tab on my keyboard, and what I want to do is have a space between the first name and the last name. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit the space bar on my keyboard, and I'm going to hit Tab. Now, if you look carefully at the text line 2, notice that I put quotation marks around that space. That's a benefit of using the function builder to build your functions. Had you been manually typing this out and you forgot those quotation marks, you're going to come back with an error message. And my text 3 is going to be B5. And we can see here it's going to say Holly space Feltner. And we'll click OK. Because this section has a table attached to it, it went ahead and filled that down for me. If I go back to the last name here and I delete the space before Feltner, notice that the concat function populate as well as the functions over here. Now I want to look at concat in a different way. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a couple of columns here. Put my cursor in H5, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a sentence using the employee name and the number of hours worked. So let's go back to the insert function. I'm going to select concat, and this is what I want my sentence to say. Holly Feltner worked 40 hours this week. And what I'm going to do is populate parts of the sentence with information from this table. So the first thing that I want to select is C5. I'll hit space on my keyboard. I'm going to hit the space key on my keyboard and type in worked. If I don't, it's just going to be a bunch of text squished together. I'll hit space again, hit tab. Now I'm going to select G5 so that 40 displays. I'll hit tab. I'll hit space again, and I'm going to go ahead and type in hours this week. I'll hit period. So that becomes a sentence. And this is what's going to produce. Holly Feltner worked 40 hours this week. Watch what happens when we click OK. Excel went ahead and predicted that I was going to carry this through and added it to the table. And now we have a sentence for each employee with their name and how many hours they worked this week. The last function that we want to look at here is TEXTJOIN. Right here, I have a few addresses. And what I want to do is combine this all into one line separated by commas. And we can use the TEXTJOIN function to do this for us. I'm going to put my cursor in E13. I'm going to click on Insert Function. We'll type in TEXTJOIN. The TEXTJOIN function concatenates a list or range of text strings using a delimiter. So we'll click OK. For this, our delimiter is character or string to insert between each text item. So what do we want to put between each cell? I'm going to add a comma space. And I'll hit tab. Notice that the function builder put quotation marks around that. That's important. The next part of this is ignore empty. And we're either going to put true or false. It says if we put true, it ignores empty cells. For this, we'll go ahead and type in true, even though we do not have any empty cells. And then it says our text1 is going to be a string of text that we want to bring together. For this, it's going to be the range A13 to D13. And we'll click OK. Let's see what happens. Notice it went ahead and it put all 4 of those together, and it added a comma between each one of those cells. Let's go ahead and drag that down. And it went ahead and populated that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete the Miami Garden City. Let's see what happens. Notice that Excel went ahead and updated that reference. It did not add a space comma twice. It just ignored that cell. I'm going to go back to this cell. And for this, instead of having true, I'm actually going to delete true and I'm going to put in false. Notice that when I added false, that it added a space comma. And that's because it's no longer ignoring that empty cell. For the subdomain, the CONCAT function and the TEXTJOIN functions are definitely the most difficult for people to understand. Practice is going to be key for this. Make sure you put some time into practicing using these functions in Excel.